welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision making as a parent of a demand avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Hi, everybody. I am doing a live on eating today, and I hope that my sound is better than last time. But something happened with my son this weekend that made me think about how far we have come with eating. At the same time, from the outside looking in, he doesn't eat that well at all. So I have 5 things to help you think about how to approach eating with your PDA child, especially if this is their stickiest basic need, and we'll talk about that. But first, I just want to tell you sort of where we started in burnout and then where we are now, and then I'll get into the tips. So when my son reached burnout, he was 4.5 years old, and he had never been a great eater, but he had never been like an eater to the point where I was worried about nutritional intake. He was breastfed for a year. I made all organic foods, all the things. I did baby-led weaning. I read all the books. But increasingly, as his pickiness increased, I got increasingly anxious. And as we know, PDA kids perceive our energy and our intent to make them eat things. But at the same time, I also doubled down on my traditional parenting and behavioral techniques of you have to sit at the table until you eat X, Y, and Z. And so this coincided with burnout. And at his lowest point, he was really only eating one thing at a time, not enough of it to sustain caloric intake. And we were concerned about nutritional health and growth. And this was really also apparent when we moved from Washington, D.C. to Michigan. And at that point, he was only eating Honey Nut Cheerios out of a particular bowl. And I remember him throwing them in my mom's face when they were delivered to him in a bowl that wasn't the one he wanted. So I was obviously incredibly anxious. I didn't know about PDA at the time and just did not understand why he wasn't eating. At the time, we were working through a sensory lens. Flash forward 3.5 years later, and eating is still his stickiest basic need. And what I mean by that is it's the one that it's hardest to get traction on in terms of him eating a broad array of things. Sometimes he struggles a little bit with sleep, but eating is really where the control coalesces when he's having a hard time. Right now, he usually fluctuates between around 5 to 6 preferred foods. And right now, those foods are popcorn, Pirate's Booty, Lay's potato chips, Doritos. He does eat granola bars in his backpack, and here's where the progress is, and I'm going to talk about how we get here. He has developed an awareness of why we eat food and does not have the same resistance to it or trauma around it. And this weekend, he was talking to me about drinking milk with hot chocolate powder in it. And I brought up the topic of collagen peptides, which I used to try and mix a bunch of things into his drinks so that he would get protein or vitamins, and he would always sense it. But I said, do you remember the collagen peptides? I wonder if you would feel ready to put a tiny bit in because you're trying to build muscles now and you want to be strong for ninja class. And he was like, yeah, let's try it. And he also asks for steak and sometimes Culver's chicken nuggets. And I know these aren't he's eating an array of a million vegetables and we're having green smoothies. Of course, that's not success in my world, but I do feel heartened that he's taking on the responsibility for his eating more and more. And it's not a point of these horrific power struggles. So if this sounds like success to you, which if you have a neurotypical kid, you're going to be like, how is that success? He eats potato chips. Like, why are you talking to me? However, I trust that you are the right audience for this. But how I want to help you get to a place where you're more at peace and not constantly anxious about your child's consumption of food is to talk about 5 things. And this is going to be unique to your child. But the first pattern that I notice with working with hundreds of families is that, especially when a child is in burnout or when they have when they're approaching their threshold of tolerance, whether it's in a week or a day, that they have one sticky basic need that's most impacted. Okay, so, we have the basic needs: hygiene, eating, toileting, sleep, and often in burnout, all 4 of those are impacted. The nervous system of our children will disable them from accessing those basic needs. But for our family, it was eating. Right? He did have some struggles with some toileting and sleeping, but it wasn't this moving into a 24-hour sleep cycle or needing to use diapers again. So that's the first thing I want you to think about, is whether or not eating is the sticky basic need or where control coalesces for your child, because the way that you approach supporting them has to reflect that. If it is their stickiest basic need, we really need to be careful and manage our energy even more around that, because the pattern in terms of like looking at indicators of coming out of burnout and improving is really going to reflect whether or not it's their sticky basic needs. So for eating, for my family, that's like the last one that we still sort of look very atypical from the outside with, if that makes sense. And if it's just something they struggle with, then we don't have to be quite as careful about emphasizing it. I hope that's making sense. So reflect for yourself, like when my child is having their hardest time or when they were in burnout, what is the one basic need where you saw the most struggles? Okay, and feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you're listening to this as a podcast episode, just, say it out loud to yourself, your partner, or think about it. Okay, so the point here is just recognizing whether it's the stickiest, and if it is, really letting go even more around it. The second thing to think about, and I know that this is, it's definitely a component piece of the experience. It's the sensory experience. However, so often when we're working with therapists, or even when we're initially working through the sensory processing lens, we infer that all of their struggles with food are based on their sight, their smell, what the food looks like, tastes like, feels like in their mouth. And therefore we work with them through a sensory lens. But the key here is that a lot of the protocols and even supports for sensory processing disorder, if they're not applied with autonomy and nervous system accommodations and a PDA lens, they can actually backfire and make it harder for your child to eat. And so that's not to say you should not have your child in occupational therapy, or that you shouldn't be approaching food and eating with medical professionals and therapists. It's just to say that, and I'm going to talk about this, we need to have some accommodations that really account for the main mechanism, which is that your child's brain perceives threat every time it perceives a loss of autonomy or equality to those around them. Thank you for all the waves. You guys are so supportive. Love it. So in terms of like what we can do in implementation, the first thing I would say, and this applies to you, your partner, your parents or in-laws, if they're around when eating is taking place, and therapists working with the child, which is to manage your own anxiety. Oh, hey, Mom. Hey, Mom. My mom just joined the live, so I'm saying hi. Is to manage your own energy around it, because it is very easy as a parent to drop into severe anxiety and like sort of this impatient energy of like, we have to solve this right now. This is a basic need. And I know that all of you have felt this, whether it's like your child is not sleeping, your child is not eating, right? Like your natural instinct as a mother or father, or someone who loves the PDA child, is going to be like, shit, I need to fix this right now because it's going to impact their well-being. But paradoxically, like one of the major things we can do is just like try as hard as we can to model for our child that we've got this and that like it's okay, right? Because we need to sort of like dance on that edge of letting go, but also signaling to them that like, we're going to figure this out and I'm in control here. Not control in the sense of like, I'm the authority, but just like you're going to guide them through. Someone just said this, it's not just sensory, is a massive light bulb moment. Yes, no, for me too. I spent like a year and a half just working through the sensory lens. And so often these wonderful sensory accommodations that can really help our children backfired or degraded trust between us because I wasn't allowing there to be autonomy within the sensory accommodation. So that's just something to keep in mind. So when I work with parents in a coaching container or in a package that's more intimate, sometimes we work on this letting go practice or managing our anxiety like one day at a time, right? Because we have brains that go from 0 to 100, we catastrophize. And so I'm never going to say to a parent, like, just don't worry about the fact that your child's not eating, but rather, can we in the moment for the next 2 days, let go? Can we just not worry about it for 2 days, right? And then we like reflect after 2 days and then we work again to see if we can stay in the moment, because remember that they sense and perceive the way that you feel about it. Okay, and the more you're trying to make them do something, the less likely it's going to happen. The fourth thing I want to talk about is just like the accommodations that I always talk about on this page, but want to show how we would apply them to an eating scenario. Okay, so the first one is obviously autonomy, freedom, and choice. Okay, so this can be applied to where your child eats, how your child eats, what they eat, and, what they're doing when they eat. I know that there's trade-offs because like personally, I let my son eat when he needs and he eats on the couch and I always have crumbs in my house and it's a lot of work for me, right? But the benefit of him actually being able to consume food outweighs the cost of a really messy living room. But you have to see the causality there or else you're not going to make that decision. The next is incorporating offerings or strewing. So this is just like a visual or sensory cue that something is there that they can engage with or not. This is from the homeschooling literature, Sandra Dodd. It can be very helpful to not say anything at all and just leave out a buffet of choices. Always preferred foods nearby them, like when they're watching an iPad or when they're doing Legos, right? So it doesn't have to be a mealtime. It can just be, I'm going to put out 6 choices and set it next to them without saying anything. Okay, and this is something that I still do, especially when my son is struggling more. So let me just give you context. For example, my younger son's 4th birthday was on Monday. Right? And birthdays are obviously hard for PDA kids because there's that automatic sensation that their sibling or another kid is above them, which sets off the threat response. In addition to that, my now almost 8-year-old PDA son has decided he's ready to get rid of his pacifier. Because at home, this is an oral regulation tool that he uses, and I allow it to regulate himself. And so he has decided, I know it's like such a big deal. I gave up on it 3 years ago and I'm just like, oh my gosh, he's actually ready. And the reason is because he wants to do a sleepover with one of his friends. So he's really working on it, but he's irritable, just like you would be if you were quitting smoking or something. So where I see this also playing out, not just in his behavior, is in his eating. right? So this morning, he was having more trouble starting his meal, starting to eat his chips, take his medication, etc. And so I applied the strategy of a buffet, right? Just bringing him a bunch of things so he doesn't have the demand of even articulating what it is he wants. Additionally, I offered, like, which we do sometimes when we can see he's peaked, is like, you can eat a treat before you start eating. Maybe that's what Venom, which is what he calls his threat response, would like to get your body ready to eat. It's totally counterintuitive as a parent, okay? But remember, we're just working to de-escalate or preempt that threat response, which gets in the way of our child eating. Using declarative language, I always err on the side of not using a lot of spoken language, but hi guys. Yes, I see someone talking about tendency to overeat. So I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm talking about like kids not eating, because it's two different things. So but you can use the next accommodation, which is the declarative language, right? Which is saying, I'm noticing, or I wonder, or you can, or I can, right? So when my son's like, I can't eat, I say, I can do this. I can go get you some popcorn. I can get you a glass of water, instead of saying, do you want a glass of water, right? Because that direct question will immediately have his brain perceive a loss of autonomy, equality to me, threat, and we're escalating, right? We're either activating or accommodating. The next pattern, which has been so interesting for his occupational therapist to see, and for me as well to learn from her, is just having those preferred foods that are very common in autistic children. And I've actually done some coaching with an autistic adult around this to understand it. But that the PDA kids, they often add in a preferred food, and then after a period of time, whether it's weeks or months, they drop a preferred food all of a sudden, which is why if you're anything like my family, you don't buy in bulk, because for so long it'd be like, okay, I'm going to buy like boxes and boxes from Costco of Pirate's Booty. And then he'd decide, I don't like it anymore, right? So, just using that to your advantage of the novelty, right? They're the preferred foods, but also understanding like it's going to become an internal demand eventually, and that's okay. It can come back. But when we're working with an occupational therapist who specializes in eating, my son's been in feeding therapy for 3.5 years, and I'll talk about that in the last point, which is on therapy. It was a very confusing pattern to her, and part of why she started to recognize that my son was different than other neurodivergent children she worked with, because when they would work through a play and sensory model and a child would add a food in, it would be an expansion of the total amount of foods. But with my son, he would add something and then drop another, and it would always hover at the same amount. And so that's a pattern she also sees when she works with other PDA kids. So that's something to keep in mind, and just know that like it's typical of these kids, right? It doesn't mean they're never going to eat it again, but we allow them to drop, and you can use it to your advantage to introduce new things that will sort of override that threat response. And then, so those are the accommodations I would suggest. Like if you want to share, I'm going to put this into the podcast. So if you want to share this with your occupational therapist to introduce sort of these accommodations if you are working on feeding therapy. And the final point is therapy, right? So there's two main types of therapy that I'm aware of for eating, of two variations. One is like the more behavioral approach, and the other is the more play-based exposure approach. We work with the SOS protocol, which has 32 steps towards eating. So like the first step is just being in the same room as something like broccoli, and then the kid will put it on their nose and drop it into a bowl, and their forehead and their lips, and spit it into the bowl, and eventually might eat it and swallow it. But there's 32 steps between being in the room with a food and having it go into your mouth. Okay, so it's a very gradual exposure-based approach. It's very, it's very play oriented. Like the first time we did it, we used like hammers and smashed the food and we made art with it and we spit things and, but even though it was play-based and exposure-based, it was still not giving my son enough autonomy in order to make it successful. And so like any therapy that you do, even if you're working with a professional, it has to be adapted to a PDA child. And so what we did, we dropped the home protocol because that was too stressful of like having him try things and be exposed to them at home. We allowed him to have a preferred food throughout. So he munches on like, he'll have a Twix bar when he first gets there. He can get up and down and like search foods in the refrigerator instead of needing to sit. He can decide not to do food school. We call it food school. Some days he decides to. He decides when he's going to do it. In the middle of the OT session, he'll say, let's do food school, and we'll do it. And he'll munch on Cheez-Its in between the exposure foods, which gives him a sense of control, right? So it's not like, okay, you had your Cheez-Its, now we need to move on to the other foods. And these are subtle things in addition to like the therapist managing their energy, not having an agenda, allowing it to be fluid, using declarative language, all the things, but actually altering some of the protocol itself. And obviously you need to have a therapist who is willing to have a curiosity mindset and be open to learning about PDA, but they can make a ton of traction. Oh my gosh, hi Christy. I just saw one of my best friends from childhood on here. So fun, so fun. Okay. So like any other therapy, there's no like therapy is bad, therapy is good. It just needs to be adjusted for our kids. And because there isn't like a huge awareness of PDA, you will be the one who needs to educate the therapist in order to apply this in a way that's supportive of your child. So I'm so happy to be here with you guys. I hope that was helpful to get you some more clarity on how to support your child with eating. I'm taking a note of the person who asked about overeating, and I will think about that. I actually haven't worked closely with any coaching clients who had that issue. Let me think about it. Okay, that's all for today. It was so nice to see you guys. Thanks for your waves. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye from Michigan. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses on my website, www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program. Enrollment is now open until January 11th, 2023.